This is American Government for Monday, yesterday, September 13th. And if you remember, on last Friday, I didn't quite finish my presentation of the Constitutional Convention. So I'm going to take about 15 minutes of today's time or yesterday's time to finish that up. And then I'll lecture on the notes that I passed out on Sunday night. And that has to deal with what I will call the theory of the Constitution. And more about that in a minute. So if you're looking at the notes from last Friday, my chartograph of the Constitutional Convention, here's as far as we had gotten. We had gotten to the recess between July 26th and August 6th. And again, there were two important smaller committees during the course of the convention. And this was the first of the important smaller committees, the Committee on Detail. It consisted of 11 people, and their job was to take the collected notes and suggestions and the reworked provisions of the Virginia Plan that had been modified, if you remember, by the Great Compromise to include the equality of representation of the states in the Senate. And the Committee on Detail then produced the first rough draft of the Constitution. And they produced a document of about 22 provisions. Again, if you compare it to the original Virginia Plan, it's very similar, but there are some important differences because in that month and a half of the convention between the first 2 weeks of the discussion of the Virginia Plan and then after the Great Compromise, they actually modified quite a bit. And here's just a small anecdote about when they resumed on August 6th. Now, by the way, let me remind you that August 6th is an important day in American history. If you remember, that's the day that we dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and then 2 days later on Nagasaki. So August 6th has been a fateful day in American history for all kinds of reasons in world history. So on August 6th, then, the convention resumed its meeting. And of course, they didn't have Xerox machines or copying machines, so they had what were called amanuensi. Amanuensis was essentially a copyist. And so they made 55 copies of the rough draft. And remember, on this first day of the convention rules, they had adopted the provision to keep the deliberations of the Constitutional Convention secret. And this anecdote will reveal both how seriously they took that and also the remarkable respect and admiration, if not awe, that George Washington was held in by his contemporaries. Remember, he was one of the tallest people of his generation, and so was Jefferson, and as opposed to John Adams and James Madison, who were almost hobbits. So anyway, they had distributed copies of the rough draft produced by the Committee on Detail, and evidently one of the delegates had put it in his back pocket, and as he was climbing up the stairs to Independence Hall, it evidently had fallen out of his pocket and fell onto the steps, and he was unaware of that. And it just so happens that not long after that, George Washington came by and found the copy and walked in and called the meeting to attention. And if you'd ever got in trouble in a class, like when the teacher said, "All right, I know which one of you did this, step forward." Of course, nobody ever did that. So that's what he did. He said, "I challenge any of you who were so careless of your sworn duty to keep this material secret to step forward," and nobody did. So that's the awe that George Washington commanded. I assume he made them stay after the session, clean the erasers or something like that. Anyway, so on August 6th, the convention then resumes its serious debate over the amended Virginia Plan. And almost immediately, the second great tension point in the convention was reached, and that was on the issue of slavery on August 8th. And just like on the Great Compromise of the question of how the people or the state should be represented in the Congress, the question of slavery almost derailed. By the way, it's interesting. It almost derailed the Declaration of Independence, and it almost derailed the Constitutional Convention too. And so the upshot of this intense debate and the the minutes of the records of the convention are quite uh, uh, fascinating for the intensity of the rhetoric. And of course, you could say that this was a glimmer of the tragedy that was eventually to overtake the nation in the Civil War. But at any rate, the South essentially, well, we'll discuss what the South won when we turn to the next subject, and that's the role of the place of slavery in the Constitution, in the founding, which is our last topic on the founding. Um, but what, as you'll see when we do our intensive review of the Constitution next week, you'll see that what the South won were the three provisions that protected slavery, although it never actually mentioned slavery. In Article 1, Section 2, the 3/5 Clause; in Article 1, Section 9, the Migration and Importation Clause, the Slave Trade Clause; and in Article 4, Section 2, the Fugitive Slave Clause. So uh, um, historians still debate how much of the victory that was, but you'd have to say this was a compromise that kept the Constitutional Convention in session. And after this great stumbling block, then they from most of August, they went on and hammered out smaller details. An important development, by the way, was when the presidency, which I'll come back to in a minute, it became clear over the course of the convention that a new kind of executive theory was developing in which you'd have a very strong executive. One of the interesting things that happened during August was many of the powers that had been given to the Senate alone were either moved to the president or shared with the president. And that's a growing indication. That was an indication of the growing power of the president in the constitutional system and the awareness of the delegates of the theory of separation of powers and checks and balances, which we'll talk about when we talk about Federalist 51. The last major stumbling block, or the last major point of contention, then at the end of August, around August 31st, was how to elect the president. Because once the president began to emerge as at least an equally strong office constitutionally with the Congress, the question of how to elect the president became a critical matter. And as you'll see, and we'll come back to the Electoral College later on in the course, if you think about it, there were only three ways to elect the president. The standard mode of election in most of the state constitutions was that the legislature actually elected the president. The framers abandoned that because they realized that if the Congress elected the president, just like in the states, the legislature would be able to control the president. The second possibility was, and it was proposed in the convention, was direct popular election of the president. But the framers did not seem to think that that was logistically possible. Travel was terrible and information was difficult to convey. So, and there was probably some suspicion about on the part of the framers that the Democratic masses would be able to weigh the qualifications of the president. But at any rate, they rejected that, and that meant the third alternative, that the president would be elected by a temporary body that would come together just for that purpose and then disband. And that was the Electoral College, and that was agreed to towards the end of August. Then the second important committee in the convention was convened between September 5th and September 12th, which, as I already remarked several times, yes, was my birthday. You should lower your heads in silence for a few minutes. But at any rate, that was a 5-person committee, and it made important changes in the final draft, and that was its function, to produce the final draft of the Constitution, which it did. Many important issues that determine how, for instance, certain specific presidential powers are interpreted were worked out in this, because it turns out there were 3 very strong executive members, Gouverneur Morris, Alexander Hamilton, and James Wilson, on this committee. So very important work, and that produced the 7-article Constitution that you and I are familiar with, and that you'll become very familiar with in about a week. So the convention then continued some last-minute business. 3 members, as I already mentioned, left the convention because they were critical of the work. James Mason, Edmund Randolph, and Elbridge Gerry, 2 of Virginia and 1 from Massachusetts. They considered that the president was too powerful in the constitutional system, and the other main defect which prevented them from giving their agreement to it was it possessed no Bill of Rights. And we'll talk about more about the meaning of a Bill of Rights later on in the course. So September 16th was the last working day of the convention, and originally the racial representation for the people in the House of Representatives, the original number was 1/40,000, at least one representative. As you're going to see, by the way, it's much more than that. It's about 1 to million now because of the growth of population and other things. But in the original draft, it was set for at least 1/40,000. And George Washington, the only time he had an active role besides shaming that person who dropped the rough draft, was he stepped down from the president chair on September 16th, and he proposed that the number be reduced to 1/30,000 so that people would have more confidence in the Constitution. And that was agreed to unanimously. He resumed the chair, and September 17th then was the last day when the Constitution had been written out, and the members then signed it, and they adjourned, as they said, sine die, which is a governmental term for without another convening date. So I want to, if you look at the bottom of this page, I have a quote from Benjamin Franklin, and it's of some emotional weight to me, because Franklin was a fascinating individual. At this point, by the way, he was very old. He died about a year after the convention. He was ill. He could barely speak above a whisper, and all the times when he spoke in the convention, he had actually written out his notes and gave them to somebody else. But as you're going to see, as in the last minutes of the convention, he remarked to somebody standing next to him, and Madison overheard it, evidently, and included it in his notes as the members were signing the document. The members then proceeded to sign the instrument. While the last members were signing it, Dr. Franklin, looking towards the president's chair, at the back of which a rising sun happened to be painted, observed to a few members near him that painters had found it difficult to distinguish in their art a rising from a setting sun. I have said often and often in the course of the session, and the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to its issue, looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now, at length, I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. The Constitution being signed by all the members except Mr. Randolph, Mr. Mason, and Mr. Gerry, who declined to give it the sanction of their names, the convention dissolved itself by an adjournment sine die. James Madison. So we can debate how successful the American Constitution has been. It was certainly not perfect. Although I will say this, one of my favorite quotes is from an English statesman, one of the two Jewish prime ministers in the 19th century, Disraeli and William Gladstone. Benjamin Disraeli, they were from Jewish extraction. And William Gladstone said of the American Constitution that it was the single greatest work of the mind of man ever struck off at a single time and place. And I have to say, after a lifetime of studying the Constitution and its drafting and founding and its interpretation, I am inclined to believe it, if only because, by the way, the rest of the world has more or less followed the American example, and the Constitution has, in fact, become something of a model for modern written constitutions. Okay, so with that in mind, let me go back and do a couple of summary comments, and then we'll turn to the theory of the Constitution. So if you look on the notes for Friday, I remember I put that cute little summation of the essence of the Constitution in an easy to remember formula, and that is, remember when we discussed the Declaration of Independence. Remember, the framers thought that 2 + 2 was a self-evident truth, but not negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, the quadratic formula. So maybe this is just as difficult, but it may help you put it together. So what's a good way to summarize the essence of the Constitution as it came out of the convention? The Constitution equals essentially the Virginia Plan. A strong, popularly based national government with separation of powers, directly elected and representing the American people now as the basis of the Union. Yet, as we saw, the Great Compromise, where the small states refused to yield on the question of the equal representation of the states, That's why in the formula I have a little s. So that means the Virginia plan modified by the equality of the Senate, really taken from the New Jersey plan in the Articles, plus H with a Roman numeral 2 subscript, and that's the Hamilton plan. Because as you know, one of the things that made Hamilton's plan different from the other two plans that had preceded it um, was the remarkably strong executive. And Hamilton had an important influence, as did several other strong executives. And so the presidency coming out of the Constitution was very different. And even Madison, who was probably fairly advanced in constitutional theory at that point, did not have a very clear idea of the functions of the executive, both in terms of executive power and the constitutional system. So you'd have to say the other main difference between the Virginia plan as the original plan of the convention is Hamilton's strong Article 2. And as we'll see when we turn to the presidency, the interpretation of Article 2 and its very broadly drafted language has unquestionably been the basis for the growth of the presidency over time, in addition to, of course, the growth of the United States as a foreign power, the growth of the nation and the economy and the complexity of government. Now, that's in the numerator, and in the under the denominator, in the denominator under the whatever the numerator is JR, and that stands for judicial review. If you remember when we discussed the other two plans, remember one of the main problems of the Articles of Confederation was that the states regularly disobeyed the Articles and the uh, the Congress underneath it, and uh, so state compliance with the requirements of the Articles and with the laws of Congress was one of the things that almost destroyed the system. So if you remember, everyone who came to the convention knew that something had to be done about that. And if you remember, the proposal that Madison had made would be for the Congress, through the regular legislative process, to review all the laws of the states. And that was probably rejected because I think they realized that Congress would have enough to do screwing up the nation on its own, would have enough to do just following the nation's business on the national level. The New Jersey plan, interestingly enough, also had the power of the executive to call out the military power of the Articles of the Confederation to enforce a state. And the reason they rejected that was they realized that every disagreement of opinion between a state and the nation would turn into a civil war. And they realized that might be an ultimate resort, as it, by the way, was in the Civil War. Lincoln held the Union together with military power. But the eventual resort to the eventual solution that the framers came up with was the in Article 6. It says that this Constitution and all the laws of the United States shall be the supreme law in the land. We'll talk quite a bit about that next week. And then how is that enforced? By the judges in the states. So in other words, what the framers realized, a better and stabler and more consistent way of enforcing national law was to allow the courts to be the place where collisions between state laws and policies and the Constitution and national laws occurred. And so with that, there you have the essence of the constitutional system. Let me very briefly uh, finish with what I like to call the three great novelties of the Constitution. That is to say, the framers were not philosophers, although they were studied in the books of modern philosophers, which were very influential on the American framing, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution. But they did build three things into the Constitution that no political system had ever done or achieved in human history. And to understand the three novelties, you have to understand the either or that preceded these great novelties. And then you'll see that what the framers did was they stepped outside the box, so to speak, when it came to designing a government. So the first great novelty, which takes some task to explain, and that's what we're going to turn to in the course right after we finish discussing the Constitution, is the new federalism. That is to say, prior to the United States Constitution, you had either one of two kinds of political systems. You had a national system where sovereignty was collected and expressed to the nation on the national level, or you had confederations like the United Nations or the Athenian Confederation or the Netherlands Confederation. And what a confederation is, and of course that was the Articles of Confederation, was you had sovereign states that were united in a central system, but the sovereign states retained the power. The states were the actual members of the confederation. And so what the framers did was, in fact, create a new kind of federalism, where you had a national government, strong national government over the entire nation, and you also have state no longer sovereignty. They're not, the states lost some of the sovereignty that they had under the Articles, but they're semi-sovereign. And so if you look at most of the constitutions of the world, like France and England, those are national systems that have all consolidated power. They have local units of government, but the local units of government derive all their power from the central system. That is not the case with the American Constitution. And so the Constitution tries to keep the states both as vital centers of government at the same time to create a sovereign power over them. So the new federalism, which divides sovereignty between the states and the national government. We'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks. The second great novelty was the extended large republic. Now, prior to the United States Constitution, there had been many large political systems in human history. They were kingdoms or empires, like the Roman Empire, the Babylonian, the Chinese Empire, etc. And there had also been free governments, like where the people ruled the system, either in direct democracy, like in Athens, or in the American states to some degree, or through representative institutions. Most political thinkers and statesmen had thought you can't, a republic in which the people's sense really rules the government, as the last line of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address says, the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Most thinkers and statesmen did not think that you could have a free, popularly driven government over such an extensive territory, and that ultimately, if you made the country big enough, you had to resort to like imperial power or a heavy bureaucracy led by an overweening executive. So what the framers did was, for the first time, to create a huge, diverse national republic. Never been done before. And as you're going to see, that's what Madison is explaining in Federalist 10, so we'll come back to that. The last great novelty is the new Republican and constitutional executive. And by Republican here, I don't mean Republican Democrat. I mean popularly based. We're going to talk in Federalist 10 about the similarities and differences between a democratic system and a Republican system. But here, I mean the same thing, where the people, the spirit of the people essentially directs the government. And so before in human history, you had many strong executives. You had kings, emperors, dictators, department chairs, and you had small republics. But it did not. But most thinkers did not think you could actually have a strong executive, limited by constitutional structures and consistent with the will of the people. But the framers, in fact, managed to create one of the most powerful executives in the history of the world that it was nevertheless part of the constitutional system, and in some ways is tied to Republican popular responsibility of the people. So we'll explore each of those three novelties more in the remaining weeks and months of the semester, but I felt it was important to give you some sense of their presence in the constitutional system and how the framers managed to pull it out of the hat. So if you have the notes from Monday, I sent out, in addition to the class notes, a chartograph of Federalist 10 to create a stunningly effective visual device to help you work out the argument. Now, both the argument in Federalist 51 and Federalist 10 are actually pretty well constructed arguments, and this chartograph, I think we'll have time for me to walk you through it, actually shows you how well constructed the argument is, and I hope to make you see that. So what I want to do first, before we actually examine the content of the structure and argument of both of these remarkable papers, I want to talk about what it means for there to be a theory of the United States Constitution. Strictly speaking, what I mean to say is is there's a fairly self-conscious theory of human nature that undergirds the creation of the institutions of the Constitution. And so I want to talk about that and how the framers produced it. And then I want to introduce you briefly to the structure and layout of the Federalist Papers. And to talk, Wilson in chapter 2 talks a little bit about the Federalist Papers, but I want to give you some sense of where these two papers are from and what the Federalist Papers did um, uh, in terms of the struggle for the ratification of the Constitution. By the way, once the Constitution was submitted to the Congress and then passed out to the states for ratification, then the country exploded into a continent-wide debate over whether or not to ratify the Constitution. And that debate took place in churches and taverns and towns and in newspapers. America had, at that point, if not the highest, one of the highest rates of literacy in the world. That may puzzle you as to why Americans, this is, of course, before the invention of social media and the internet, but why would America had one of the highest rates of literacy? Because the expectation that the masses should be able to read was never part of most of human societies. But in the Reformation, in the 1500s, when both Luther and Calvin criticized the sacramental and hierarchical authority of the Catholic Church and made the argument that every believer should be able to read the Bible, of course, that meant then for the first time you had as part of political culture the idea that most people should be able to read. But that was a new thing in human life. And of course, the founders of the colonies were Puritans following that Reformation in embrace. And so America had had more newspapers than almost any other part of the world and more people who could read them. So this extensive debate that took place over the Constitution was primarily fueled by different essays. And most of the participants for and against the Constitution wrote under a pseudonym, a pen name, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So what does it mean to say that there's a theory of the Constitution? If you're looking at the notes, as I say, what we just finished talking about in the last day or two was how the Constitution was constructed so as to meet the crisis of the failed system of the Articles of Confederation. The framers were not political philosophers. They were almost all of them college educated, and they had read some philosophy. And the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Baron de Montesquieu, and David Hume, and other philosophers was fairly influential on their thinking. But again, they were not philosophers. Most of them were practical statesmen. And on the other hand, they were also very knowledgeable about history. So even though they were practical statesmen addressing the problems of the government in front of them, given that background, they actually did reflect on some aspects of human nature that the systems, the institutions they were designing were meant to address. And if you look at the first paragraph on my notes, the other thing I argue is, since the Declaration of Independence, our founding document, which contains our regime's ideas, remember, the Declaration directly appeals to nature. It embraces nature. It talks about nature and rests its view of humanity on nature. So you could say that the American constitutional system, the American regime, began with a direct, an explicit directing of human attention towards the natural world and how we emerge out of it. What I'm saying, in other words, is that in some ways that our founding ideas are an appeal to nature, natural rights, inclined to some degree the framers to also reflect on the aspects of human nature that both give rise to government and also require well-deserved government, as you'll see. And Madison even has a great phrase in Federalist 51 to that effect. So again, most of the framers had served in practical government, and they knew the experience of government under the colonies and under the British system, and they were also, as I said a minute ago, historically informed too. So as you're going to see, there is something of a fairly consistent view of human beings underneath the constitutional system, and the most elaborate presentation of this set of ideas is in these two remarkable essays by James Madison. And in Federalist 10 and 51. As you'll see, I decided to present Federalist 51 first and then come back to Federalist 10 because Federalist 10 is the more complex argument. So, what were the Federalist Papers? They were 85 newspaper editorials composed by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay under the pen name of Publius in New York to aid in the ratification of the Constitution. And 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 they were very rapidly collected, and they were understood to be really towering points of argument. And they were distributed to the rest of the colony, the rest of the states, to aid in the ratification. And since that time, these 85 essays are considered now an indispensable commentary on the Constitution. During the both impeachment proceedings against President Trump, both sides, both supporting impeachment and opposing it, would often waive their Federalist Papers to prove. So they've almost become as important to the interpretation of the Constitution as the words of the Constitution themselves. That's how important these essays were, and how thorough, thoughtful, and well drafted they were. And by the way, we now know that Hamilton wrote most of them. He wrote about 2/3 of these essays. Madison wrote a third of them, and John Jay, who took ill, only wrote 5 of them, although some important ones. So if you're looking at the notes on the bottom of page 1 and the top of page 2, it's the outline of the Federalist Papers. So let me just walk you through that, and you'll see where Federalist 51 and where Federalist 10 occur in this outline. So, of course, all good compositions have both an introduction and a conclusion, and Federalist number 1 is the introduction, Federalist number 85 is the conclusion. It's as if they knew that some professor would be grading them someday. The second section, if you're looking at the top of the notes for page 2, is on why we need a strong union and why a strong union is important for the country. And as you'll see, Federalist 10 literally opens with the statement, among the other advantages promised by a well-constructed union. So if you think about it, most Americans were convinced that they wanted the country to remain united. They may not have supported the Constitution, and many Americans did. It was very close, by the way, did want to stay with the Articles. Nevertheless, almost all Americans, if you're a debater, it's good to start with something that both sides agree on. And so the first major position of the Federalist Papers is to explain what a strong union is for and why it's valuable, even if most Americans already probably share that. The second, which goes from paper number 13 to 22, are the actual defects of the Articles of Confederation. And some of we've discussed, by the way, and Wilson discusses these. For instance, that it had insufficient power to secure the nation's good, but that Hamilton makes the argument in these papers that the main defect of the Articles was it was a confederation. The confederation was a means to the end of national existence, and his argument was you could never have independent states united in a confederation that will be able to secure the good of the nation. So in that section, he talks about the defects of the Articles. The next section, the third section, actually the fourth section, if you count the introduction, is from number 23 to 38. And you've actually read part of this. Remember, I gave you part of Federalist 51 to help explain what a self-evident truth was. In this section, mostly Hamilton explains why, since people were afraid of the Constitution because they thought it was going to create a tyrannical form of government, or a government that would be too strong and that would eventually eat up the states and the people's liberties, the next step was for Hamilton to argue that if you're going to have a nation, you've got to have a government at least as strong as the proposed Constitution. And the next section from number 39 to 46, is defending the Constitution against 2 charges that its opponents made, that the Constitution was truly not a federal system that would destroy the states, and it was not a republican, it was not a popular government, and that would be ruled by elites. Now, if you remember, these are complex because there were certain new aspects about the Constitution that many people didn't understand. And so Madison takes to understand why, even though the Constitution lays out a new kind of federalism and a new kind of republicanism, it is still a genuinely federal government and a genuinely Republican government. Then, Federalist 47 through 51 is a set of general essays that have to do with the nature of tyranny and how governments come to become tyrannical and what's the best means for preventing government from becoming tyrannical. And that is the separation of powers and checks and balances. And and so if you see that Federalist 51 is the last essay in this section. And what Madison does in this section is he goes through different ways that people have tried to solve the problem of tyranny, different systems, and he shows that they've all failed, and that the only way to prevent and by the way, this section also has what the framers defined as tyranny, the concentration of all power in one set of hands. I'll come back to that in a minute when we actually talk about Federalist 51. So in some ways, this section leads up to Federalist 51, and then Federalist 51 lays out the theory of separation of powers and checks and balances in the Constitution, as you'll see. And so that's why Federalist 51 starts out with, to what expedient shall we finally resort? Because it's actually the end essay in this section. So after this general theoretical introduction to the separation of powers, then the rest of the Federalist Papers just follows the natural the organization of the institutions in the Constitution. Federalist 52 through 61 are about the House of Representatives and its construction. Federalist 60 through 66, I have the wrong numbers there, by the way, are on the Senate. 67 through 77 are on the presidency. And 78 through 83 are on the judiciary. So just literally legislative, executive, judicial. Federalist 84 is singularly devoted to the question of a Bill of Rights. And in that paper, Hamilton argues that the Constitution didn't need a Bill of Rights, and in fact, it would be better off without it. And we'll revisit some of those arguments later on in the course. But as you know, the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. And then the last essay is the conclusion. So that's the outline of the Federalist Papers and its organization, and that's where these two great papers fall into the organization. So with that in mind, let's look at Roman numeral 3, the theory of the Constitution, part 1. Federalist 51, the separation of powers and checks and balances. So, as you're going to see, the framers became not only smarter about the institutions of government in the 11 years between the Declaration and the Constitution, they also, in some ways, learned some limitations of human nature, as you're going to see, and in some ways, certain limitations of democratic government. So, government means institutions. That's how you create government, as you saw from the Declaration. You create institutions and you delegate power to them, which the people pool together from limiting their natural freedom. And so that's how government is created. That's where government's power come from. But we all know, and in fact, I'm a political scientist, and I have to say that when you look at the 7,000 years of human political history, ever since we climbed up out of the slime and learned how to build houses and cell phones, you'd have to say, looking at human history, if politics is part of the human condition, most political systems have probably been worse than better. Most political systems have a tendency to degenerate into tyranny, abuse, and incompetence. Those may not be mutually exclusive either. And so if you're going to create a government, you immediately confront the power of tyranny. So what is the meaning of tyranny? And I've already quoted that. And this, by the way, is from the great French thinker de Montesquieu. Tyranny is the concentration of all governmental power in one set of hands, whether it's a king, a legislature, a judiciary. And it may help you to understand what's the problem with concentrating all power in one set of hands. And if you've read any great literature on tyranny, like in the Greek tragedies like Oedipus or the Shakespearean tragedies, the tragedians analyze tyranny from what you might say a psychological or a spiritual sense. And here's what that's based on. most of you know that human beings are not angels. In fact, Madison says so in Federalist 51, if men were angels. We're not gods. My mother was a pretty good person, but most of you understand that human beings are not perfect. We're flawed beings, and that somehow human nature is like a mean between two extremes of animality, and because we have passions, and some of us have a lot of passions, and and on the other hand, we have something like reason. Remember, the Bible says that in Genesis that human beings are created in the image of God. So even though we have bodies like the rest of the animal kingdom, yet we have a capacity of reason. But the delusion in human life is that just because we have reason and we can talk, that somehow we're freed from bestial passions. But in reality, the animal parts of our nature are always there, which is why we're not angels. And so, in some ways, all power in one set of hands. What happens is and by the way, if you've never read Shakespeare or the Greeks, then you could do worse to read Harry Potter. Because, as I've mentioned, I've taught several classes on Harry Potter, and I think Voldemort is actually a great literary presentation of the meaning of tyranny. When there are no limits on human power, then even the best of us start to forget that we're human beings, and we start to treat other human beings as if they were beasts and we were gods. And that's why tragedy studies these things in literature, because once a human being begins to think that he or she is a god, uh, um, then they actually become monsters. And so, in some ways, the solution to the psychological or spiritual problem of tyranny is an institutional solution where you don't let the conditions of tyranny um, exist. And so that's exactly what Madison then comes to explain in Federalist 51. Now, you have to remember that other American institutions, the state constitutions, had some version of separation of powers, but they were failed and unsuccessful because in reality, the state constitutions gave almost all the power to the legislatures. So the legislatures in the states controlled the governors and the judicial systems. And as Jefferson says, that 153 tyrants is as bad as one, meaning the tyrants, the legislators who behave tyrannically. So you don't need a king for tyranny. A legislature can be tyranny. A judiciary can be tyranny. And as we're going to see when we come to Federalist 10, even the people can be tyrannical. So what's new in the Constitution is the addition of checks and balances. So let me explain that. So it turns out that we say separation of powers and checks and balances in one phrase, and in reality, they are a little bit different. To no one's surprise, separation of powers separates the institutions of government and then divides the powers of government between them. And we'll see that in the opening clauses of each major section in the Constitution. The vesting clauses, Article 1, all legislative powers, all executive powers. So the Constitution does create three branches of government with differently divided and assigned powers. But to make sure that one branch can't take over another branch, checks and balances actually take a little bit of each power and give it provisionally to the other branch so that the other branches have some power to defend themselves. So, for instance, the veto power, which the president has, you're going to see that that's described in Article 1, Section 7. And remember, Congress has legislative power, the power to make and decide laws. But the Constitution does give a little bit of legislative power to the president, who can say no to laws. Actually, it requires him to sign laws. But at the same time, the Constitution safeguards Congress's possession of legislative authority because it gives the Congress the power to override a presidential veto. In the same way, the president has the power to appoint the judiciary and the other members of the executive branch, but the Senate has power to ratify that. So if you look at each of the whole constitutional system, by and large, the powers are mostly separated. But around the edges, there's this little bit of blurring that allows the other branches to defend themselves should one of the branches become voracious and try to upset the constitutional system. And of course, it's a little messy when you have these three branches sort of squabbling at each other for 200 and some years. Now, the other new thing, and this leads to the new theory of human nature in these two papers. And let me just be explicit about that, because even though there are different issues being addressed in these two papers, the separation of powers, institutional tyranny in Federalist 51, and popular tyranny in Federalist 10, both tendencies for the institutions of government to become tyrannical and for even the people to become tyrannical have to do with problematic aspects of human nature. And as you're going to see, what the framers relied upon was, for the first time, a kind of fairly explicit embrace of selfishness, and the naturalness of selfishness. Now, by the way, if you had siblings when you were growing up, you can get carried away with selfishness, but it's healthy for people to take care of themselves and to attend to their interests. And besides, nature constructs us to want to do that. So as you're going to see, both in Federalist 51, when it comes to the institutions of government, and Federalist 10, when it comes to restraining the tendencies of tyranny in the people, they both have an ingenious way of recognizing the force of human self-interest, and at the same time, both of these papers then rely upon that same force to restrain and moderate it. And that's what I hope to make clear in laying the argument out. So in addition to the constitutional separation of powers and checks and balances, which Madison calls the means, the solution to the problem of tyranny, you have to find the means. Madison also says you have to resort to motives. And by the way, look at the essay again, and this is some of the most famous language in Federalist 51. And Madison knows that in relying upon self-interest, this could be viewed as a kind of a low view of human things. We like to think of human beings as noble, and sometimes human beings are noble. But the framers designed the institutions of government so as to address what most human beings are like most of the time. And most of us, most of the time, are probably not moved by the highest of motives, not necessarily devilish motives, but we're looking out for ourselves. And so what the framers tried to do was to take that human tendency to look out for yourselves and build it into the very construction of the institutions of government. So Madison knows when he first lays this out, he says, it may be a reflection on human nature that such devices are necessary, that you have to appeal to selfishness. And then Madison goes on to say, but what is government but the greatest of all reflection of human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were available to govern men, no auxiliary precautions would be necessary. But the practical problem of government is you're creating structures where human beings are going to govern human beings. And therefore you have to find some way to restrain those people who have that kind of power by appealing to their motives. And he says you have to match their self-interest with the constitutional office. And so Madison makes this explicit. And here's the most important sentence in this respect from Federalist 51. This policy of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives. I have to pick this apart because there's some older word use in this, and so let me actually translate it into contemporary English by supplying. Supplying doesn't mean to provide something, it means to make up for the lack of something. And the defect of better motives means the lack. The word defect here means lack. So what is the policy of the Constitution in appealing to the self-interest of office holders? This policy of making up for the lack of better motives by creating opposite and rival interests. Our politicians, when they're arguing about politics and the Constitution, it's often not a pretty sight to look at Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump down there in the mud scrabbling with each other, and Joe Biden with Mitch McConnell, etc. But it's that very squabbling which actually keeps the institutions of government in line. So even though it's not pretty to look at, nevertheless, self-interest is a reliable energy, and that's what the framers attempted to incorporate here. So you recognize the force of self-interest in a moderate way, and then you use the energy of self-interest to restrain self-interest. You use selfishness to control human selfishness. Now, I'm actually going to only talk for about another 5 minutes because I want to keep the lecture to 50 minutes, and I'll finish this up tomorrow. And but anyway, let me begin by laying out the argument in Federalist 10. So, as you're going to see, Federalist 10 now addresses a problem that kind of took the Americans by surprise. Today, even most Americans think that democracy, rule directly by the people, is simply a good form of government. That would be true if human beings were angels. But even in society with democratic government, people can often become tyrannical towards other human beings in society. We've seen that in our society with racial prejudice and other kinds of majority and minority prejudice. But wherever people have the majority in society, just like an overweening tyrant, if there's no limit on the power of a majority in society, then that majority, the people themselves, can become tyrannical. I've been married before, so I know it can happen. Just kidding. So, as I said before, the Constitution sets up the world's first huge republic. So you have to remember what Madison and the framers had to do was to explain why this new experiment of this huge, diverse republic was not only possible, but what Madison is going to try to do in this paper is to explain why it's preferable to the smaller, more intimate republics of the states. So it turns out that this new kind of extensive, huge national republic solves, or at least addresses, one of the enduring problems of popular government, democratic government, and that problem is faction. And so Madison begins this essay with a formal definition of what the term faction means, and you should memorize that definition. He says a faction is it's a number of citizens, either of a majority or a minority, united by some common interest of passion, opinion, or interest, adverse to the rights of the whole community and to the rights of others. So all human societies, by the way, and by the way, Madison says faction is part of all societies. It's just that popular societies, free societies, let all these tensions come out. In dictatorial systems or totalitarian systems where speech and association are controlled, oftentimes the factions in society are suppressed. Nevertheless, faction is not only a part of popular government, it's a part of human life. And Madison will even say that human beings, this tendency to fall into contending factions is so much a part of our nature that even when people don't have good reasons to do it, they'll find bad reasons to find factional differences. So, as you're going to see then, the structure of the argument in Federalist 10 then, after it defines what faction is, it then divides itself into how to address that. And Madison says, well, you can do one of two things. You can either you can get rid of the causes of faction, or you can control the effects of faction. And part of the depth of this essay is Madison's argument that you can't eliminate the causes of faction. It turns out that the roots of faction are in our own human nature, in our different opinions, and our different passions, and our different abilities. And I must say, since one of my backgrounds is political philosophy, I've read almost every work that Marx wrote and that Marxism suggests. And in some ways, this is Madison's great disagreement with Karl Marx, because Marx really argued that you could arrange society primarily by eliminating private property. You could arrange a society so that factional differences would disappear between human beings, and that finally you would have a completely tyrannical free government. Well, it didn't quite exactly work out that way. And I have to say, in this respect, I think Madison is deeper than Karl Marx, because here Madison is saying, if you're going to eliminate the causes of faction, if it's true, and the way that he puts this is that the causes of faction are latent in human nature, meaning they're buried deep. So if you're going to get rid of factions, what are you going to have to do? You're going to change human nature. Easier said than done. And probably you're going to have to resort to mass murder and gulags and re-education camps if you're going to try to perfect human beings, or like something like Brave New World, where you change human beings' genetic structure. Now, Madison also says, by the way, that, and by the way, so what you can do is, if you're going to eliminate the causes, you can do one of two things. You can get rid of freedom, control human beings so thoroughly that they don't have a chance to form factions. But if you remember from the Declaration of Independence, human beings are born free. Nature makes us free and wants us to retain the amount of freedom that's consistent with living with other human beings. So think about this. If you destroyed freedom, then you would actually destroy human nature. Moreover, the only way to really get rid of the causes of factions would be to give everybody the same interest and passion and opinion. If you read or saw A Wrinkle in Time, the nice science fiction novel, do you remember when they went to the planet Camazotz and everybody had the same opinion, passion, and interest? Well, in a way, that's what Marxism tries to do. It tries to take human beings and suppress the natural differences. But again, it seems to me that Madison is right here. You would have to change human nature either through terror or through some kind of manipulation of the very genetic structure of human beings to do this. So my point here is Madison has this very realistic view of human beings. You have to take them as they are and work with human imperfections. So I'll stop here because you're going to see that that rejecting the idea that you can eliminate the causes of faction, Madison then discusses how you may control the effects of faction, and that's what we'll finish up in class tomorrow and finish the rest of the paper. Our last major topic on the founding is the one that's become very controversial in the last several years, and that's the role of slavery and race in the founding. And in the last year and a half, because of the terrible events of last year, because of the controversy that emerged, I decided to actually address this topic in my section on the founding. So as you're going to see, we're going to start with a reading from a very controversial piece of historical reinterpretation by the New York Times called the 1619 Project. So that's how we'll address the question of slavery and race. We'll look at the claims of the 1619 Project. We'll look at some criticisms, and then we'll read some other essays. And so you should read, by the way, the Nicole Hannah-Jones piece first, which is the introductory essay to the 1619 Project, and then the Willard Maclay, and then the Philip Magnus criticisms. They're quite different from each other. And then Federalist 54 is by James Madison, and I think you'll see it contains some interesting information. And then the piece by Robert Goldwin is a general reflection, as from the title you can tell, why Jews, blacks, and women are not mentioned in the Constitution. So we'll continue with this tomorrow. And as I said, I've decided to postpone the exam until next Monday. So that will give us some opportunity to clean things up on Friday and also to address any questions you might have.